Information Technology and Service Management PCB webinars. My name is Vladimir Shala, the PCB organizer of this webinar, and today's topic is risk assessment as a basis for IT hardening plan. This webinar will be presented by Mr. Adam Galash. Mr. Galash is an expert in the area of IT security, information security management, risk assessment, and has more than 20 years of professional experience. Please, if you will have any question or comments during the webinar, you may use the question box in the right-hand control panel, or you may use the option to raise your hand, and Mr. Galash will answer to them accordingly at the end of this webinar. Please, Mr. Galash, you may start the presentation.
Okay, so good afternoon. Okay, the topic I would like to discuss today is the using a risk assessment approach for building an IT hardening plan. So basically the hardening of IT system is vital for protecting the information using IT infrastructure, but the problem is that sometimes the requirements stated by this plan may have a negative impact on the usability of the system, and sometimes it makes a really big problem with using the system and supporting the business process of the organization. And the idea is to use a risk assessment to find the requirements which should be really implemented in order to harden the configuration of the systems, and just to omit these requirements which are not very important for us but may have a negative impact on usability. So here you can see my picture. As Mr. Shala said, I have some experience with IT security and risk management, and well, I established my company in 2004, and before that I worked a couple of years in IT security department in Siemens, and I collected some experience in various companies. I just delivered projects related to security implementation, risk management for various companies in automotive, chemical, telco sectors, and so on. But coming back to the main topic, what I would like to discuss today is firstly the approach for IT hardening. So I would like to discuss the basic topics related to building the hardening plan for the IT infrastructure. Then I think it was good to discuss the benefits and drawbacks of IT hardening. So the benefit is quite clear. It's just deal with improving the security of the IT infrastructure, but there are some drawbacks as well, and I think it's good to discuss them. Then I would like to say some words about using risk assessment for just finding this optimal IT hardening requirements. In other way, what's just to select these requirements which are really vital for the security of our organization, and omit these ones which are not so important and not necessary, but can make some problems with using our and managing our systems. So if we are talking about IT hardening, basically there are three main practices related to reducing the attack surface by modifying the configuration of IT systems or IT infrastructure to make it more secure. The first and quite obvious approach is just to remove all unnecessary functionality, all unnecessary services which are a part of the standard configuration of the system. If you are implementing an operating system or database or a network component, there are some standard services which are run when you are using this component, but sometimes you need them, but sometimes they are not necessary. For example, there could be a service allowing the particular remote access type to this component, but if you are not using it, it's not a point to allow this service to be run. Please remember that any service may be vulnerable to a given type of attack, and switching off unnecessary services reduces the number of potential vulnerabilities which may be present in your system. So the other approach is enforcing additional protection. For example, enforcing additional cryptographic tools, encrypting data at rest or data in transit, some additional authentication mechanism, some additional access control tools, logging mechanism, and so on and so on. So there are some mechanisms which are normally switched off, but you make them working in your system, and in this way improving the security of the whole infrastructure. And the other approach is implementing additional constraints, like for example allowing access to the system from the given workstations, or allowing the access to the system in a given working hours, or defining the timeout requirements, and so on and so on. If you are going to define which requirements should be implemented in the organization, of course you may just self-define your benchmark. So you may have to define yourself all these requirements, but lately there is a lot of various standards and various benchmarks which are available in the publicly in the internet, like for example the standards which are published by the Center for Internet Security, the standards which are published by American Department of Defense. These are STIC standards, so-called, and other standards as well. So you may just use them in order to improve the security of your system. There are also some standards which are created by the group of organizations. For example, there could be a standard which is defined by the global corporation, and all the companies which belongs to this corporation has to implement these requirements in their systems. But the problem is, so basically the positive is that there's a lot of predefined requirements which you have just to check, and if they are not fulfilled in your system, you have just to implement them. But the problem is that sometimes these requirements may be too sophisticated for your organization, and the result will be that the usability of the system will be reduced, and in fact these requirements, these safeguards, may be not acceptable for your organization. So you need to select somehow which requirements are to be implemented and which should be omitted, and you need to have the way how to select, and this is what we are going to discuss in the further part of this this presentation. But first I would like to just go with you through these various IT hardening examples. One of them is, for example, which is related to the reducing the unnecessary functionality of the system. So, for example, removing or switching the standard services or the services which were implemented in your system and which are run in your system, but in fact they are not necessary for using it. An example could be a web service. It is not only the case when you are using a web server, but for example, your system may have an administrative access using a web interface, and therefore the web server is run on the system, but in fact nobody uses it because you are using SSH instead of web access. So in this case, this web server may be switched off. The similar case could be with a file server, a mail server, and so on and so on. So even if there are some standard services running your system, you may just switch them off if they are not necessary. The other point is just removing, reducing the privileges for users and services. For example, you have a service which is run with administrative privileges, but it may occur that in fact you don't need such a high privileges for the service, so you may just create a dedicated account with the reduced privileges and run the service within this account. Enforcing password policy and account lockout policy is just a typical example of system hardening. So you're going to enforce the minimal password length, the complexity of the password, the changing the password by the users, the history of the password, lockout policy. So if the wrong password is entered a few times, then the account is locked for a given period of time or until this not unlocked by the administrator. Time constraints for network traffic, like for example protection against SYN flood attack. So you are just going to define the time frame within which the TCP session is to be established, and if the session is not established within this time frame, it just has to be established from start. Insecure network protocols may be blocked. For example, it deals with an unencrypted protocol like a telnet, or using an unsecure version of web protocols like, for example, SSL 2.0 or 3.0. So you can have a lot of various examples of IT hardening, but the problem is that sometimes there are some negative impact of this configuration on the just possibility of using the system. And a basic example is the case where the system becomes unfriendly for the users. For example, a complex passwords. So if you require the user to use a password which is 20 characters long, and the complexity is also defined, and if they have to change this password every month or even more often, I think that they won't be happy with that, and could be some problems with just remembering the password, so that it can be just written down on a paper or something like that. The similar cases with a strict lockout policy. For example, if you require the system to lock the account if the wrong password is entered twice or 3 times, it could be unacceptable for the users. Restricted access time. For example, we may define the requirement that the system is accessible only during office hour, for example, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. But sometimes it can happen that somebody will work after this standard office hour. In this case, he or she won't be able to access the system. A timeout policy. Again, if we define that the session is to be disconnected after, let's say, 5 hours of not working with the session, it may be acceptable for somebody who is just entering the data to the system, but if somebody has to analyze the data which is just displayed on the screen, this timeout policy may be not acceptable for this person. Communication problems. This is another group of topics which should be considered when you are just defining the hardening plan. For example, we may enforce using only the secure protocols, but for example, if we are communicating with our business partners which are not using this version of protocol, such communication may become impossible. So these timeouts, which are mentioned to you when we are talking about a SYN flood attack, if we are using a slow network and we enforce using very restrictive policy regarding establishing TCP sessions, it may occur that it won't be possible to establish any TCP session in such an environment. Some issues related to software. For example, we may enforce using only the latest version of the software, but our partners won't use this version. They will use the previous versions. That could be some problems with communication. Sometimes there are requirements related to, for some platforms, there are requirements related to using a software which is signed with digital certificates which are trusted for the system, but it's a very good protection against malware, but it makes a problem when the user has to run a software which is not digitally signed, but they are still required due to the business of this organization. The benchmarks for systems hardening define the requirements for the logging policy. So there's a description which events should be described in logs, and usually the range of these events is rather wide. But the problem is that if you have to store such a huge number of events in your logs, you need to have a lot of space for storing this data, and also these logs should be analyzed. So you need to have people, you need to have a time for analyzing these logs, you need to have a tools which are properly configured just to find out these events which have a really very important impact for the security of the system. So as you can see, just defining the proper IT hardening approach is not a very trivial, because from the one point you want to improve the security as much as possible, so this hardening policy should be restrictive. But from the other point, if you exaggerate, you may make a system totally unusable. So you have to find a balance between the security and usability, as always. And here the risk assessment approach may be absolutely helpful. And just to remind the basic points related to risk assessment, so you need to identify the risks. So you need to identify the assets, the threats, the vulnerabilities, the current safeguards. Then you have to estimate and evaluate the risk and make a decision if and which safeguards should be additionally implemented. So in our case, which requirements stated by the benchmarks should be implemented and which one could be omitted in our organization. So if we're talking about the assets identification, so the question is which components of IT infrastructure should be hardened. So that's clear that these standard components for which the benchmarks are available should be considered during the hardening process. So these are the operating system, databases, the applications, standard application servers, network components, and so on. But of course, if we have a tailor-made software implemented in our organization, the requirement related to hardening this software should be considered as well. The problem is that usually we don't have a already prepared a benchmark, so we need to create these hardening requirements for this tailor-made software ourselves. But I believe it shouldn't be a big problem. Which data is processed using IT systems? So it deals with the information what is the negative impact of losing the security of this system. So if this data is very sensitive, we should consider more restrictive hardening policy, and which this data is just a normal data, not very sensitive, this requirement may be relaxed. Considering scope and content is relevant to IT hardening, so it deals with this, which part of IT infrastructure should be considered at least at the beginning of the process as the most important, and in order to implement the IT hardening policy. The important thing is just to identify the threats and estimate the risk related to these threats. So basically you have to analyze what may happen to our IT infrastructure and how we are currently protected against it. So Are there any vulnerabilities due to the misconfiguration, to the lack of additional safeguards, external safeguards, like for example, if we are considering operating system configuration and we are discussing about vulnerabilities, it doesn't deal only with the configuration of this operating system, but it deals also with the environment in which this operating system is working. For example, a network infrastructure. If the server with this operating system is protected by the firewall and IPS and some other tools, some requirements related to hardening the network stack are not so important because there are other external safeguards which assure this protection. The main problem, if we are talking about this threat analysis approach, which I think is a quite good approach and gives us a lot of benefits because it allows us to select these requirements which are really important for us, is that this benchmark, at least this one which are publicly accessible in the internet, are created using a little bit different approach. So this benchmark is just a checklist. There's a requirement and you're either fulfilling this requirement or not. But if we are using this threat analysis approach or risk assessment approach, you need to find out, in fact, why this requirement is important to protect our system. So in other way, you need to understand which risk is reduced using a given requirement from the benchmark. So the good approach would be just to taking the benchmark, analyzing each requirement or each group of requirements and find out against which threat this group of requirements protects the system. So, and if we know it, we may just perform this risk assessment process and just to find out which requirements are really important to protect the configuration of our system. So, basing on this analysis, we are finding the requirements concerning the configuration of the IT system, configuration of the operating system, configuration of database, application server, and so on. So, summing up, we are performing the risk assessment. We are finding which risk is acceptable for us and which risk should be minimized or treated in other way. And after that, we are selecting from the benchmark the group of requirements which allow us to reduce the risk which is not acceptable for us. Before doing it, we need to find which risks are reduced by the given requirements or the group of requirements in a benchmark. However, it may happen that given requirement is not acceptable for us, or which may, that this requirement may make an additional problem for our IT infrastructure. Again, I would like to come back to the case of SYNFLUD attack. So if we are going to protect our system against this attack, we may just harden a TCP stack, just to creating a time frame for establishing a TCP connection. But as I mentioned before, it could be a problem with establishing the connection in case if the network is slow or there are some traffic problem within the network. So of course, we may just implement this requirement, but we may implement the safeguard the safeguard, like for example the IPS system, which has to detect the probe of performing the send-through attack, and if this IPS system is fulfill our requirements, it's not reason to implement the hardening of TCP stack in order to protect the send-through. So we have another safeguard which protects us against a particular attack, in this case a send-through, and we don't need to implement this requirement from the benchmark because it may make us some problems with the usability of our infrastructure. Okay, so coming back to the summary of this presentation. So it's obvious that IT hardening is vital for improving the security of the system, of the whole IT infrastructure. In fact, it is not possible to assure the security of IT infrastructure just using the additional tools like, for example, additional firewalls, IPS, and so on, without a hardening of the components. So it's obvious that we need to define, implement the IT hardening plan. The problem is that we need to select these requirements which are really important for our organization. Implementing all the requirements stated in benchmark without a previous analysis may lead to some problems, because it may happen that our system is not usable any longer, or the managing of the system requires a lot of effort. We are not able to just to assure that the people will perform all these activities related to the administrate this hardened system. So the question is how to find the requirements which should be implemented, and how to find these requirements which are not really really necessary for our organization, or these requirements which well, instead of implementing these requirements, we just may implement the additional external safeguards like this IPS from this example. And in order to do it, we may just use a risk assessment. So the basic idea from this presentation is that we don't need to use this risk assessment only for the global analysis of the IT infrastructure, but even we are just concerning the hardening of the particular part of IT infrastructure, given server or the group of servers, we may just use this risk assessment. It may be very helpful for us to make a decision concerning the protecting of these IT components. But the problem is that if you are going to use this risk assessment, you need to understand what in fact is stated, or in fact is written in this benchmark, and why these requirements are listed there, and why they should be implemented in the system. Okay, so this is what I wanted to tell you today concerning using a risk assessment in the process of IT hardening. If you have any question, just ask and I will try to answer it. Thank you.
Mr. Galash, thank you very much for this highly informative presentation. And since we have some time left, we will go through some questions. The first question is, one of the attendees has asked you, how often do we need to conduct IT risk assessment?
But we are talking about the general risk assessment, or the risk assessment concerning this IT hardening process?
Yeah, in fact, in IT hardening process.
Okay, I used this approach when we considered implementing the hardening for the given systems. So it was done on the project by project basis. But if we are just looking on it from the internal perspective, I think that you need to review the security of the systems according to your internal audit policy. So at least once a year, or even more often, it depends. And I think that as a part of this review, you should perform the risk assessment. So summing up, always when you are just going to modify the configuration in order to harden it, and also always when you are just reviewing this system configuration in order to check if it's secure.
Okay, thank you very much. And another question, it's only technology enough to protect us from threats?
Of course not. Of course not, but well, during this presentation I discussed the hardening approach. So this is just only technological approach, just to improve the security of the system configuration. So in this sense, we were talking about the technology, but of course we are talking about the general security. This not only with technology, so the technology is only the part of it, and I would say the most important factor are people. So but this is a topic for another presentation, I think.
Thank you very much. I can see that Mr. Rule has raised his hand, so I'm going to unmute his microphone and he can ask his questions. Dear Rule, can you hear us?
Yep.
I think his microphone is not working. So Mr. Galash, we don't have any other questions. And I want to thank you once more for this great presentation and answering the questions. I want to thank all the attendees as well for taking time out and join us on this webinar. We really hope you enjoyed this webinar and you can watch this presentation recorded and view the presentation slides on our website www.pcb.com. At the end, I just want to inform you that next Monday we are hosting another webinar titled The Significance of the Shift to Risk Management from Threats and Vulnerability Assessment in Information Security Management System. Thank you for joining us and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.